Good evening. Welcome to the Faculty of Education annual EdTalk. My name is Melanie Jansen, and I'm an associate professor here in the faculty, and I'm so pleased that you've all decided to join us tonight for our lecture by Kira Brandt-Bierikoff entitled Resilience and Indigenuity, Reconciliation in Times of Crisis. I'm also co-hosting the session tonight with Michael Chan and Alundra Elder, our senior stick and vice stick internal of the Education Student Council. And I'm thrilled that they're here to join us tonight. And in just a minute, they'll introduce Kira and take over the session. Before we begin, I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional territories in which the university is situated. The campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. For those of you who are joining us from a territory perhaps outside of Treaty 1, I encourage you to just take a moment to acknowledge the place in which you're situated and to consider your space in times of truth and reconciliation. And without further ado, I will now turn over the event to Alundra and Michael.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending this session. Kira Brandt-Bierikoff is a Haudenesaunee educator, academic, and lifelong learner from Tyendinaga, Mohawk Territory, Ontario. Kira is a PhD candidate in the Department of Curriculum and Pedagogy at the University of British Columbia, where she is currently writing her dissertation on theorizing the possibilities of estrangement and homecoming as grounded in Haudenesaunee teachings. Kira has taught in Ontario and British Columbia as an elementary teacher, teacher educator, and professional development facilitator for practicing teachers. Some of her recent projects include facilitating an Indigenous book club for K-12 teachers in Vancouver, identifying cross-cultural connections to the ancestral knowledge of fourth-year NITEP students at UBC, and conducting research on treaty education in Aotearoa, otherwise known as New Zealand, for her master's thesis. She has published on theorizing reconciliatory pedagogies, reconceptualizing Indigenous teacher education, and using autoethnographic metissage to deconstruct systems of colonialism in higher education. Tonight, she will be speaking about resilience and indigenuity, reconciliation in times of crisis. If you have questions throughout the session, please ask them through the Q&A function, which you can find on the bottom right of the Zoom screen, and Mike and I will ask them on your behalf at the end of the session. Please welcome Ms. Brandt-Bierikoff.
Thank you so much, Alundra. Thank you for the beautiful introduction and embracing me with stumbling around indigenuity. It's a made-up term and not the most eloquent one, but we'll get into it. Once again, thank you, Alundra, and my most heartfelt appreciation to UM's Faculty of Education, in particular, Dr. Melanie Jansen and the EdTalk committee for this wonderful invitation to be here with you tonight. I'll pull up my presentation and we'll get into it. So here we are tonight. I really want us to engage in thinking about resilience and indigenuity, thinking about resilience, innovation, and Indigenous response, particularly moving forward, thinking about what does reconciliation, reconciliatory pedagogies look like in times of crisis, both in terms of a historical analysis, drawing upon examples, but more importantly, I think bringing history, bringing Indigenous lessons of resilience, innovation, indigenuity, if you will, into the contemporary, into the now, and what does this mean for us as educators during COVID-19? So my name is Kira Brandt Burakov, but my Ganyageha name is Gayat Noro. I am Haudenesaunee of the Mohawk Nation, and my ancestral community and where I join you from tonight is Tyendinaga Mohawk territory. Tyendinaga is where my family is from, and it's where I was born and raised. I moved around quite a bit for school and travels, and just recently found my way back here when my husband and I moved back to Tyendinaga a few months ago. And so I join you here tonight from my great-grandfather's cabin and I think pretty steady rural Wi-Fi. Tonight, I will draw upon some of my research, but a lot of my teaching. I moved out west to join the Faculty of Education's as a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia. And so most of my work and my research has been in teacher education and thinking about reconciliation and critical pedagogy. It's on a lot of that work and some of the conversations that I've had with colleagues, with knowledge keepers, with elders, activists, and community members that informs all of the work that I do. And so I don't do any of this work alone. And I acknowledge the many mentors and the many conversations that I've had. It brings so much depth to the work that I do. As we begin, I'd like to invite all of us to first ground ourselves in a moment of silence to honor the lives lost to COVID-19. I think it's easy for us, a year in, to begin to normalize the inconveniences that COVID-19 has had in our lives. And it's a privilege to be here tonight to speak about Indigenous education and Indigenous resilience and moving forward in a post-COVID world, when truly the only thing that matters is the safety and the well-being of Canadians. And for so many, that's been compromised. I'd like then to begin with a moment of silence to honor the lives lost, to honor the loved ones who are grieving, and to send our strength to those that are currently dealing with hardships that seem insurmountable. Thank you for joining me. An overview of our discussion here tonight will be premised around opportunities to interrupt, to regather, and to move forward together as we consider reconciliation through a lens of Indigenous resilience, as well as lessons to bring forward in our practice in a COVID-19 educational discourse. Above all, what provoked this talk tonight has been a deep reflection on Indigenous resilience in the face of crisis. This discourse of Indigenous resilience is really nothing new. I've seen incredible work over the past 10 years by Indigenous and settler educators, activists, community members, reframing narratives of indigeneity as resilient. However, the broader discourse of indigeneity, particularly in our curriculum and K-12 classrooms, continue to perpetuate dangerously outdated concepts of indigeneity as something which is static, and by consequence, something that cannot have value in our contemporary educational discourse, aside from its anthrocultural significance. I wholeheartedly disagree. What I hope to offer tonight is for us to think about specific examples of Indigenous resilience to both reframe the discourse that pervades our curricular conversations around indigeneity and culture, while also illuminating lessons from Indigenous resilience in the face of crisis to perhaps offer some guidance and some hope in our generation-defining crisis, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. So let us interrupt. Even if you aren't familiar with the name Edward S. Curtis, you might be familiar with his work. Characterized by his pursuit to capture the Native American spirit before it disappears at the turn of the century. His photograph, here entitled The Vanishing Race, literally captured the settler sentiment that Indigenous peoples are riding off into the sunset, one last hurrah before the future arrives. Much of his work immortalized images of the stoic Indian, solemn and serious, who was desperately trying to hold on to their culture as it slips into the ancient past. Not only does Curtis's photography capture the white gaze of who they think Indigenous people are and what they think Indigenous people do, like stare endlessly onto empty plains, but also captures the imagination and romanticization of Indian nostalgia. Coupled with the fact that Curtis would often travel with his own props and costumes, which he would dress his participants up in if they didn't look Indian enough, these images do not only represent who Indigenous people are today, but it doesn't even represent who Indigenous people were in yesteryears. Curtis, struck by the call to make Indigenous peoples live forever through his somewhat fictionalized documentary-style photography, the legacy that he left us with captures the sentiment of the vanishing Indian, perpetuating the notion that indigeneity was somehow most authentic prior to the arrival of the white man, and that contemporary indigeneity is elusive, disingenuous, and fragments of what was once whole and pure. Again, although we might not be familiar with or use Curtis in our own teaching or our own lives, his work does capture the sentiment that is reflected in our educational discourse around Indigenous culture and identity, and that is the discourse of the vanishing Indian. The vanishing Indian narrative perpetuates the idea that Indigenous peoples literally vanished from the landscape over the course of contact and colonization. We see remnants of such narratives when we speak of the physical erasure of Indigenous populations, or the fleeting loss of culture, language, and identity, or the violent seizure of land. The narrative suggests that Indigenous peoples weren't meant to be brought into the future. Their culture and identity was too pure to be modernized, and so it vanished in a time gone by. Here suggesting that colonization was quite literally inevitable. The danger of the vanishing Indian narrative lies not in the literal discourse of Indigenous peoples dying off, so to speak, because I do not wish to dismiss the realities of colonization. Yes, colonization has had violent, forcible, and irreparable impact on our cultures, our languages, and our relationship to land. But this isn't the only narrative. And this is not because Indigenous peoples were incapable of change. We've never been static, or people whom are nostalgic for the past or resistant to change. Indigenous culture, language, and identity has always been fluid. While the vanishing Indian narrative simply captures one of Edward S. Curtis's pictures quite literally, suggesting that authentic Indigenous identity is a relic because it broke under the pressure of modernity. We see evidence of the vanishing Indian discourse in our textbooks and resources in Canadian history, certainly. Most evidently, I see it in the binaries of pre-contact and post-contact life for Indigenous peoples, where pre-contact life is perceived as pure utopia, where Indigenous peoples lived in harmony and balance with the natural world. I hate to pop this bubble, but if you take any meaningful look at Indigenous history, we have always had conflict, growth, and a whole lot of warfare amongst Indigenous nations. If you know anything about the Haudenesaunee Confederacy in particular, particularly prior to the formation of the Confederacy, our history is defined by the pursuit of peace because of constant violence and warfare. New nations were made, languages dissolved and emerged, alliances and treaties made and broken. There was literally never a time where our nations were static or most authentic. Of course, this can be juxtaposed in our Canadian curricular discourse with the image of post-contact, presented as the complete antithesis of pre-contact Indigenous identity. Post-contact is perceived as the exploitation and assimilation of Indigenous peoples, whom were often presented as the passive victims of colonization, which again couldn't be further from the truth. Our ancestors were intelligent, informed, multilingual cultural navigators who had a clear vision for what they wanted for their descendants and sought reciprocal alliances wherever possible with settlers. Once again, to be clear, I'm not attempting to simplify or smooth over the realities of colonization, for it was nothing less than an apocalypse for so many Indigenous nations on Turtle Island. But quite the opposite. I wish to bring back some complexities to these narratives to demonstrate the ways in which our Indigenous communities have always been receptive to change, innovation, and adaptation, but never lost sight of what was most important to hold on to, such as our relationships with land and transmission of our ancestral languages, for example of which we know settlers had a different vision in mind. So tonight I invite us to reimagine the oxymoron of contemporary indigeneity as a means of interrupting the discourse of the vanishing Indian. When I think of innovation and adaptation to change, I think of the opportunities that my ancestors saw in Mohawk ironworking, the men and women who walked the high steel, as it is often called. Many of us are likely familiar with this heavily popularized photo of ironworkers having their lunch atop skyscraper. But what we might not know is that almost all of these men are Haudenesaunee. It is reflective of the ways in which ironworking has become a fundamental crux to our Haudenesaunee communities, financial livelihoods, and identity since the 19th century. But when we look at images such as this, passing by this mounted photo in, say, IKEA, as I've seen it before, we might not see indigeneity represented in it until we see the relationship between contemporary indigeneity and opportunities to seek innovation in the face of modernity. For adaptation, even if we begin with the most heavily romanticized and appropriated image of Indigenous lifestyle, the image of the warrior Indian riding horseback on the Great Plains, this too is reflective of Indigenous resilience to adapt and see opportunity in creating relationships with horses. The influence of horses and a riding culture forever changed Plains' identity and livelihood in the best possible ways, not without sacrifice and challenges, no doubt, but it is considered an integral aspect of Indigenous identity for so many nations. Lastly, there are so many examples I could speak of here to elucidate Indigenous resilience, but we need not look much further than the resilience of our survivors of Indian residential and day schools in Canada. Survivors sharing their truths and their healing journeys to educate Canadians of the realities of the Indian residential schooling system. Out of the pain of residential schooling, our survivors demonstrate the most ancient of Indigenous teachings: to seek strength in community, to forgive, to heal, and to ensure future generations know where they come from and where we must go together. So let us now regather. As we regather here, I want to stress a reconceptualization of Indigenous knowledge so that our curricular and pedagogical discourse is reflective of Indigenous knowledge that is defined as fluid and responsive to change, especially amidst crisis. So this brings us to the concept of indigenuity. I use the term indigenuity as a way to illuminate Indigenous ingenuity, innovation, adaptation, and resilience, as has been the theme tonight, to interrogate the ways in which contemporary Indigenous knowledge is often framed as inauthentic, or as a colonized, incomplete fragment of something that is otherwise a relic. I use the term very tongue-in-cheek here, embracing kind of the irony and the silliness of the term, trying to bring back some humor and lightheartedness to Indigenous education. I think it looks quite clever written down, but when you say indigenuity quite loud, it sounds like something that might be stuck to the bottom of your shoe. so I don't take myself too seriously here with the concept. But what I want to propose is a way of consolidating what contemporary Indigenous knowledge is comprised of to deconstruct the vanishing Indian and other assumptions we continue to cling to in Indigenous education. Bringing this indigenuity or contemporary Indigenous knowledge into conversation with our present realities today, I believe that there are so many lessons to be learned when we study Indigenous innovation and adaptation, and how Indigenous peoples have survived in times of crisis and immense change without losing ourselves. What does it mean to bend, not break, in the face of a generational defining crisis? I have to say, I'm kind of glad that the returning to normal discourse seems to be fading, as I'm not sure, or at least compared to, I think, how common it was at the beginning of the pandemic, of the pursuit of the return to normal. And I'm grateful for this because we cannot chase this return to normal. It isn't healthy or realistic or sustainable, particularly if we are grieving for a normal that maybe wasn't even nourishing or good for us in the first place. It isn't easy to embrace change, and you don't have to accept it lying down. But perhaps amidst this chaos, you can at least seek balance, seek routine, while you attempt to establish a new normal that is forever in flux. Also drawing upon the teachings of Indigenous resilience, I also feel grounded in thinking about who I am and the work that I do can honor the past, indulge the moment, and live for the future. So what does it mean to think across time and to hold this intention of how I carry myself? How is it that the work that I do will inform future generations? And I can honor the past without being stuck in it. My practice is forever forward-looking as a researcher, as an educator, but also just simply as a human being. How is it that my relationships with the natural world and with my loved ones can continue to be forward-looking to honor that my actions, my choices in this moment affect future generations? Next, for clinging tight to the traditions that matter, identify and prioritize what is sacred to you, your life, your practice, your community. Cling to this. Compromise where you have to, but don't lose sight of what is important. And let everything else go that you cannot control or that is not sacred to your well-being. When we cling too tightly to the past out of desperation or fear for the future, we lose opportunities to embrace change, or worse, we lose ourselves altogether. Our ancestors knew what was sacred to our identities and what would be needed for the future. They made that choice for us, and it carries us through these hardships. And now we have the responsibility to decide what is sacred and what is worth protecting for the new generations yet to come. Seek strength in community. For Haudenesaunee condolence ceremonies, it is the responsibility of other clans and other families to carry the grieving process for you and your family in times of loss. It is not meant to be carried or burdened alone. They will literally carry the grief for you, cook for you, take care of your matters for you, because there is strength in community. When the weight is too much to bear alone, I don't have to. Where are we creating and seeking strength in community? Have we built enough community in, say, our classrooms, or with our teaching partners, or with our colleagues or our loved ones? Who is your community to seek strength within? And is it time to build or rebuild these communities so we can carry on together? And so with this, reflecting on moving forward together. In light of indigenuity and the lessons we carry forward with us, there is still the responsibility to consolidate contemporary Indigenous knowledge with images of the vanishing Indian narrative in our educational practice. So here reflecting on perhaps some ideas for how we can ensure our practice is responsive to indigenuity. Quite simply, I think that there's power by just seeking contemporary Indigenous voices. There are resources, artists, authors, elders, knowledge keepers who surround us with these contemporary voices. So challenge these antiquated ideas of Indigenous knowledge as being stuck in the past, or worse, framed as something that is literally past tense, such as the prevalence of phrases like Indigenous peoples used to do this, or used to believe this. Seek what is contemporary. Reimagine the active resistance of indigeneity, both as historical and contemporary resistance. I often ask my teacher candidates to tell me about the 20th century Indigenous experience in Canada. And so some common responses will be, of course, the experience of Indian residential schools, the Oka crisis, perhaps, the White Paper of 1969, Indigenous veterans and the right to vote. But when I push them to give me at least one example of Indigenous joy or success in the 20th century, they struggle. I ask them if they are aware, for example, pictured here, of Discourse, the Cayuga and Oneida chief who traveled to the United Nations, or then the League of Nations as it was known in 1929, for Haudenesaunee sovereignty. Or if, for example, they're aware of the origins of Bannock as an act of reclamation during starvation and rationing tactics by the federal government. Why is it that Indigenous education is so often informed by the experience of passive colonization, not of active resistance, survivance, or resilience? These blind spots in our learning are reflective of the fact that Indigenous education continues to be driven by the white experience of colonialism and not by the voices of those who actually experienced it. We need to decolonize not only what is taught, but by whom and for whom. What impressions would this then make on the Indigenous youth of this country, who instead are told that their existence is defined by resistance and resilience, not by trauma? Lastly, and above all, I think there is most promise in ensuring that Indigenous knowledge is honored as valid, valuable, and vital in our classrooms or conversations at the grocery store or whatever table we sit at, professional or otherwise. Indigenous knowledge is so much more than cultural artifacts or interesting anecdotes, but it is grounded in both deeply complex ancient knowledge systems and contemporary experiences. You get the best of both worlds, the ancient and the modern, the old and the new, the now, the past, the present, and of course, the future. Nyamagoa, for your time tonight. There is my contact info to keep this conversation going, but I wanted to leave plenty of time to address any questions and hopefully have some time for a meaningful conversation tonight.
Yes, please ask your questions in the Q&A box, and we will ask the questions to Kira on your behalf. So we just have one to start things off here. As a teacher librarian who is currently researching both Indigenous fiction and nonfiction materials for students and teachers, I am challenged by finding materials that incorporate Indigenous innovation and adaptation. Some of the novels studied in English have deep and heavy-hearted themes, and I am looking for more modern viewpoints as the residential school themes have been explored. We are looking for contemporary voices. Indigenous joy was a perfect term that covers so many more topics that include resilience and the modern experience. Would you have any suggestions to explore this?
Wonderful. Thank you, Alondra. And thank you for the beautiful question. I might ask you to repeat it in a minute, Alondra, just so I'm hitting on all the points. But the main takeaway, I think, is reflecting on seeking contemporary Indigenous voices, primarily through literature. It's been a real privilege, particularly in my lifetime, to go from being in a schooling system here in Canada. I was born and raised and grew up in my community on the reserve. And so narratives of Indian residential schools were normalized, but there definitely wasn't the availability of resources, certainly at the time. And so I think there's a lot of power and purpose to say, that we have this plethora of resources at our disposal. They need to be part of the conversation. We can't be tired of them. We can't dismiss them. But at the same time, there are certainly other narratives so that our students aren't then walking away thinking that Indian residential schools is the only thing that defines the Indigenous experience, as I think sometimes can be conflated with it in terms of the 20th century experience and certainly before. In terms of examples of Indigenous joy, I find, to be honest, I really love to use literature, primarily fiction, in my classroom to bring in Indigenous voices, particularly diversity of Indigenous voices. But to be honest, off the top of my head, when it comes to examples of Indigenous joy, I actually prefer to bring in news articles and different examples from things that are happening in Indigenous communities right now. So I actively follow on Facebook and on Instagram a variety of different communities that are close to me or that I've seen come up in the news. And then you can kind of keep your finger on the pulse of what do our communities wish to highlight. And so although it's not literature in its traditional sense, still bringing in, you're getting the quotes from the kids, quotes from knowledge keepers, and it's happening now. And then from there, with my teacher candidates, when we've used these examples, sometimes they're videos. We'll look at interviews, we'll look at documentaries that highlight Indigenous joy and different success. And then we'll kind of work out from there of contextualizing what more do we need to know about this community? Is there a possibility for partnerships or connections here? And it just really makes it very, very immediate in that it's happening now. It might be happening in our local communities. And that might kind of help us to fill in the gap as we're waiting for other literature, perhaps, that might highlight Indigenous joy and contemporary voices.
I think you thoroughly answered that question, but did you want me to repeat it just to be sure?
Did I miss anything, Alondra?
I think you covered it well. Contemporary voices. And I feel like you found ways to cover those contemporary voices.
Alrighty, thanks.
Awesome, Kira. Just another question here. When looking at community, do we not have to look at the power relationships that have existed and continue to exist and challenge these so that relationships in reconciliation are equal?
Absolutely. Sorry, Mike, could I have you repeat the question just once more?
Absolutely. So when looking at community, do we not have to look at the power relationships that have existed and continue to exist and challenge these so that the relationships in reconciliation are equal?
Absolutely. Absolutely. What I really wanted us to highlight tonight was to bring back complexity to these conversations instead of binaries or dichotomies that, pre-contact or this kind of authentic Indian was peaceful and harmonious. And then likewise after contact, that Indigenous peoples have been victims of colonization. So certainly I'm not trying to suggest that we need to be painting pictures that are either false or that don't engage with the truths and the realities of violence and of the harms done ultimately to Indigenous peoples as a result of colonization. All of that needs to be part of the conversation. But I find too often when it comes to working with my students, whether that's K-12 or whether that's my teacher candidates, too often these voices and experiences of colonization are not actually coming from Indigenous peoples. Likewise, we're often working against these assumptions and really confronted up as soon as we start those Indigenous education courses. My students are often having to confront and unlearn some of these histories and assumptions that they have about Indigenous peoples because of images like Edward S. Curtis and images of this stoic, serious Indian. Of when I think about indigeneity, I think of Indigenous women's laughter that can be heard 2 houses down. My experience as an Indigenous woman is not something of a struggle or something that is filled of pain. I'm proud to be Indigenous, and our languages are revitalized, and it's something that our students, particularly think of our Indigenous students, shouldn't be going through a schooling system that continues to tell them you're traumatized, you're colonized, so on and so forth. So it absolutely, both conversations need to be at the forefront, but there's danger when we have one narrative too much that then starts to become the grand narrative of sorts.
Continuing on with the topic of resources. Hi, I am a social worker in my master's program at U of M. I am currently compiling a resource list for an organization as a component to my practicum. This list is in part to accompany an employee training program on what it means to be an ally to Indigenous people. I appreciate your perspective and was wondering if you can recommend some resources that surround indigenuity. There we go. I got it this time.
Yes. Thank you. And thank you so much for the question as well. Absolutely. So thinking about, sorry, Alondra, I felt like there was 2 parts. It's thinking about resources for indigenuity. What was the first part?
They are compiling a list of resources for an organization as a component to their practicum.
On allyship, right?
Yes, exactly.
That's it. That's what I was missing. I was like, I knew there's a critical part to it on allyship. Thank you, Alondra. Absolutely. So there certainly is quite a bit of debate and conversation out there of familiarizing ourselves with the term allyship. I think that allyship, if starting with Google and kind of looking at the discourse, is really important for ourselves. Even if we don't align ourselves with using ally or allyship language, I think it's important to still have an understanding of how that term is being used. What does it mean to literally align yourself or become an ally to Indigenous peoples without appropriating Indigenous space or taking energies away from Indigenous peoples while we're trying to support, the reclamation of our languages or land back or what have you. So I think that allyship is important. However, I am much more kind of in favor of thinking about the responsibilities of settler and settler identity. I feel like a settler understands what it means to be on Indigenous land. You understand treaty. You understand and you actively engage in land acknowledgements and understand what land acknowledgements mean to you, moving kind of beyond the script and really just starting to think about and feel comfortable articulating what does it mean to me to be a guest or a settler on these Indigenous lands, moving kind of in that discourse in my mind is kind of a much more comprehensive way. I certainly think that an ally can be a settler and vice versa. But I think that particularly with the Idle No More movement, the term ally and allyship has started to fall out of favor just because it needs to be so much more than just a term that we cling to ourselves. It needs to be something that's very active. So in terms of resources to think about settler responsibility, I think going back to primary sources of reading the treaties and understanding the treaty in nuance or perhaps lack thereof. Certainly for people joining us from the West Coast, thinking about unceded territories and the lack of treaty is absolutely equally as important. And so I think, no scholars immediately come to mind in terms of thinking about allyship in light of Indigenous resistance and indigenuity. But I think really the more Indigenous scholarship, particularly bloggers as well, I am a huge proponent of thinking about what does settler identity, how are Indigenous writers writing about treaty responsibility and settler identity. I find that, to be honest, sometimes more rich than the things that I read in the academy, because in the academy we're so clouded down with the politics, whereas Indigenous bloggers and those writers that can just get it out there, I trust their voice more than I trust mine, to be honest, because they can say it how it is. So that would be my go-to for thinking about kind of diversifying reading.
Thank you so much, Kira. Another question here on reconciliation. Expanding on your ideas of indigenuity beyond K-12, what role do you feel post-secondary institutions have in reconciliation, particularly in education program context?
Beautiful. Thank you, Mike. And beautiful question, because I gave a presentation on this this afternoon. As I articulated this afternoon, I see particularly our faculties of education as being sites of possibility for reconciliatory pedagogies. So when we think about the role that our schooling system and the education system more broadly has to provide our Canadian youth, or whether we teach abroad and move abroad, but to provide our youth with genuine opportunities to think about the complexity of Indigenous knowledge. So that starts with having Indigenous knowledge, contemporary and historical teachings across the curriculum in as many conversations as possible. It's no longer just limited to social studies and history and perpetuating this arts and crafts kind of culture about Indigenous knowledge. It needs to be given the space and complexity for students to meaningfully engage, to understand truly what is Indigenous knowledge? What does it mean to think about an Indigenous science, an Indigenous cosmology, so on and so forth? And so I think as beautiful as that idea is that our youth have these conversations in the classroom, we first then in our faculties of education need to make sure that our teachers, whether it's initial teacher education for our teacher candidates or professional development, and for those of us that are going through in graduate school, making sure that there are those conversations so that then we have that genuine engagement first and foremost that can then inform our classrooms and those conversations with our students. So that definitely doesn't mean that we need to have all the answers before we feel like we want to tackle reconciliation or decolonizing the conversations that we have in our classroom. But I think it first and foremost starts with that acknowledgement of I'm accountable to reconciliation. I am here on Indigenous lands, and therefore I am implicit in reconciliation and have a responsibility to engage in conversation. And whether that simply means I just first need to educate myself, what a powerful place to start. But if you've already had that opportunity to educate yourself, it's now time to start to engage in those conversations with others. That doesn't mean you need to educate others necessarily. There's lots of Indigenous people out there who can provide voice and can provide experience to this. This doesn't mean you need to speak for Indigenous peoples, but it does mean that now that you know what you know, there's power in that. And so go out and have those conversations, have those difficult conversations, because Indigenous peoples, we've been having these conversations for a very long time, and it's now time to help us carry that burden.
Great answer. Thank you, Kira. The next question is someone who misunderstood what you were saying when you said to take what's needed from history and move ahead when elders and knowledge keepers in ceremony encourage us, middle-aged and young adults and children in ceremony, not to hold these traditions and ceremonial ways. I'm sorry, do you follow the question?
Yeah, sorry, could you read that again, Alundra? I'm just trying to reflect on what part that might be in.
Yep, no worries. Okay, they said they don't understand what you were saying when you said to take what's needed from history and move ahead when elders and knowledge keepers in ceremony encourage us. And then they put in quotes, middle-aged and young adults and children in ceremony, not to hold on to those traditions and ceremonial ways.
I'm not quite sure. I know which part they're speaking to. But I guess to just kind of think about this call to turn to our knowledge keepers, our elders. I think that sometimes when we think about Indigenous knowledge, it's something that is historicized. It's something that has never really been adapted or fluid. And so our elders, our faith keepers, our knowledge keepers, our language speakers, these are the keepers of these traditions and of the principles and of the voices of our ancestors. So when we turn to them, there's an immense responsibility of coming to these people. Sometimes I know with my teacher candidates, they're excited and they're well-intended and they're thinking about, I'm going to create this really comprehensive unit on land-based learning, and I'm going to invite an elder or a knowledge keeper into my classroom. And I really first try to caution them of, let's take a step back. Our elders, our knowledge keepers, our faith keepers, they have responsibility in our communities as keepers of this knowledge that is so precious and that has been intentionally kept sacred and kept alive for so long. Is that their default role to then come into our grade 3 classrooms when we're talking about land-based pedagogy? I think there's real opportunity there, but that doesn't need to be the default space. And so at least this evening when I was speaking to working with our elders and our knowledge keepers, they are the keepers of these knowledges that are certainly ancient, but just because we're working with ancient and ancestral knowledge doesn't mean that it is kind of immune to change, to resilience. So I want us to think about when it comes to contemporary Indigenous voices, and why I keep using this term, this still includes our knowledge keepers, our elders, so on and so forth. They are still contemporary people who can speak to ancestral knowledge, but also their own lived experience. So I think there is opportunity for us to engage with them. We need to be engaging them in this conversation, but likewise, this doesn't absolve us of, I think, a really immense responsibility to understand protocol and appropriate times to approach them.
Thank you, Kira. Another question here. It is without a doubt that my primary school education on Indigenous peoples was insufficient. I wonder what you think an ideal K-8 curriculum on Indigenous experience would include.
My ideal, it would all be Indigenous, so it would all be on the land, and the students would teach us. But I mean, in all seriousness, it's an exciting time to be in Indigenous education and to see it change so rapidly, even just in the last 6 years since the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I guess as a whole and kind of generally speaking, my ideal curriculum would be something that is based in the local. I know that it can sometimes be hard to find resources or to be able to connect our curriculum with the local. I know when I was working with teachers in Vancouver, so much of the curriculum is still based on, the Ontario fur trade. They had a hard time, pulling in, how do I be responsive to local Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh perspectives while I have to speak to, the fur trade that happened, especially for grade 4 students. Ontario feels so far away from BC. So speaking to the local isn't always feasible. But I think that when we can at least start to bring that in, that's what Indigenous education is about. Really, Indigenous education, there's that possibility for reconceptualizing relationship to land and recognizing that our responsibility to each other, both Indigenous and settler, we're bound together by this relationship because of our connection to land and commitment to land. So if we start to think about indigeneity being perhaps too loose or too abstract, I think we're losing sight of Indigenous identity stem to land. Therefore, when we tap into that relationship with local knowledge, it then informs relationship to local place. So I think as a whole, a very authentic first step both in terms of taking small concrete steps to think more about local Indigenous perspectives, but even as a whole, I think a really comprehensive reconceptualized Indigenous education program would still continue to focus on the local, and moving from, I think, local content and local perspectives to actually, I think the full vision being having reciprocal relationships with local Indigenous peoples. But that would definitely be, if we're thinking about sustainable relationships, that takes time.
How do you feel about Indigenous traditional teachings being taught in post-secondary? And how do we deal with the protocol that says we cannot video, record, or document the teachings in any way?
Mm-hmm. I think it's when we see and when we're presented with opportunities to engage with traditional teachings, particularly if it's sacred traditional teachings, because there is different protocol when it concerns sacred teachings. I think first and foremost, we need to honor what a privilege that is, to be presented with the opportunity to engage in these traditional teachings. These are teachings and knowledges that have survived despite it all, despite apocalypse after apocalypse on Indigenous knowledge, it's still here. And so I think when it comes to navigating protocol, it's the least we can do is honor protocol and also embrace protocol to see, I think even just learning about how to follow protocol is also an act of learning through Indigenous knowledge. And it's also an act of reciprocity. At the very least, when we are gifted that opportunity to engage with it, because you do inherit such a responsibility for that, I think that learning protocol and honoring it, it's a way of then honoring that reciprocity and that responsibility. And so I think when it comes to being in post-secondary, certainly it's precarious to say the least. We see not only with post-secondary education in terms of being a institution that is grounded in colonization of this land and colonization of thought and cognitive imperialism, but also when it comes to post-secondary in terms of the academy and research and that very contentious relationship that it has with Indigenous peoples, I think we need to understand the broader history and bringing all of that to I think navigating the protocol of traditional teachings in post-secondary. So I think it needs to be there, but it needs to be taken with extra care because it is prefaced by this history and by this broader discourse. And certainly I believe that it has a place, particularly if we call ourselves, institutions of education. It's, whose knowledge, whose education, and especially on whose land do we gather on this for. And I think it does such a disservice when it can't be a part of the conversation, but I wholeheartedly respect when it's not possible as well, and why our communities sometimes aren't ready for that relationship because there hasn't been that level of accountability or reciprocity yet.
Thank you, Kira. A bit of an open question here. What is your view on and opinion on efforts made on reconciliation with Indigenous people? Do you feel it is headed in the right direction, a good start? There's always more progress to be made? Or do you think there is an intervention that needs to kind of happen to a certain extent?
My perspective on reconciliation. I mean, for myself as a Haudenesaunee educator and researcher, I have to say that I am constantly inspired and rejuvenated by the work that I see being done around me. To hear the stories of, I come from multi-generational educators in my family, on both sides of my family, and to know the struggles and the challenges that they face to bring Indigenous knowledge into the classroom, and to see the incredible opportunities that I'm presented with is so humbling and so inspiring and so empowering. and that gets me in the feels. That makes me emotional. But certainly, I mean, in the afternoon talk, I'm still very critical of the discourse of reconciliation, particularly reconciliation being considered a buzzword. And so I use the word and I give power to the word because it needs to be defined by Indigenous peoples. If they're going to be having conversations about reconciliation, it needs to be done on our terms. So as a whole, I would say that I'm inspired, but there is so much more that needs to be done. And I think that we can set visions for where this relationship and where reconciliatory pedagogies can go, but it needs to be, once again, ever changing, ever fluid, ever responsive. So what we set for today, that can be a really powerful vision, but at the same time, we need to be open to consistently changing that, because once we try to cling so tightly onto a certain vision, it fails to be a relationship, right? If you truly are in a relationship with friends, family, loved ones, and you say, but you said you would do this 5 years ago, it's then not responsive or an authentic relationship. So I guess it's hard to say in terms of where I think we need to go, but I will say that I'm hopeful, but acknowledge the work that needs to be done.
We are just going to ask one more question here to wrap things up. It's a little bit multifaceted, so maybe I'll just read out one portion at a time. What are your thoughts in regards to the concept of decolonization and the concept of indigenize?
Definitely. So I see both playing very important roles in terms of moving our way to an education system that honors Indigenous self-determination and self-representation. I feel as though that indigenization was very necessary at a time when Indigenous knowledge was not honored as valued, right? So we had to use a colonial framework. We had to use modern Eurocentric reason as a framework that then we had to kind of tweak and indigenize and take what we could just to provide enough of a platform for Indigenous knowledge to be considered valued and valuable, because it has been considered and written off as primitive for so long and not of value. So processes of indigenization was so necessary. But I think now we are in such a different flux in this conversation. I want us to move beyond indigenization, because that asks us to first start with a Western framework and to make accommodations and modifications from that. I think that there's real possibility in thinking about decolonization, of we now no longer need to, start with Western, modern, Eurocentric thought and make tweaks. I think that we can just slowly start to tear the whole system apart. What inspires me so much is thinking about EdTalk's work of Tuck and Yang 2012 on their decolonization is not a metaphor. And they describe that decolonization is not an and, it's an elsewhere. So if we're going to talk about Western thought and Indigenous thought, we're already then kind of getting off on the wrong foot in terms of thinking about decolonization. It's a true transformation. But we see this happening. I really do think that we see this happening. But each of us have different roles and responsibilities. So we need people in the classroom. We need people in the academy. But we also need people in the community doing the groundwork. All of this is how we start to have transformative conversations. So I think that there's difference in the two possibilities of decolonization or indigenization.
I should have read out a little bit further into that question, but she also said, can we really indigenize the curriculum? Can we decolonize curriculum? Personally, it feels like we are trying to paint a blue fence red. It will always be a blue fence. And then her second part to the question was, or I guess it was more like a statement, but I am working to change the narrative around the discourse of mathematics education. And here's the question. It is without a doubt that Indigenous peoples were mathematicians. Can you recommend resources in Indigenous mathematic education?
Definitely. So I am with you. I very consciously don't really use the language of indigenization or decolonization. I think if we are starting with Indigenous thought, Indigenous identity, our knowledge systems, there's nothing to change then. We could honor it as valid in and of itself. So I am with you. In terms of math reasoning and just being mindful of time, none that come to mind, I guess, because it is so diverse. I guess it depends on what mathematical principles and reasoning you'd be looking at. But my go-to of thinking about Indigenous artwork and textiles is always a really rich place to start. Thinking about weaving, beading, the mathematical principles that go into totem carving. You can look at it across Canada of looking at Indigenous textiles and artwork and thinking about the mathematical principles there. That's just one example, but that I think has proven to be a really rich starting place for some teachers.
Any final thoughts, Kira?
I'm just so nourished by our conversation tonight. So I'm more than happy. Thank you, Alondra.
Well, thank you for your knowledge on these important issues. And thank you to all of the attendees for coming out tonight and asking your valuable questions. Have a great evening.